Picture this. Someone you love is lying in a hospital bed. A machine is doing their breathing for them. Another one is tracking their heartbeat in slow, steady beeps. And a doctor has just told you gently that they're not responding right now. You pull a chair up next to the bed anyway. You talk to them. You tell them about the drive over, about the dog, about that thing your sister said at dinner last week. And the entire time, some part of you is wondering if any of it is actually landing anywhere, or if you're just talking into a body that used to have a person in it. Now flip the scene around. You're the one in the bed. No memory of how you got there. No sense of time passing. No sense of anything at all. And then, hours or weeks later, someone tells you what happened while you were out. Except here's the question that turns out to be a lot messier than it sounds. Were you actually out the entire time? Or was some sliver of you in there, listening the whole time, unable to do a single thing about it? Most people picture a coma the way movies picture it. Someone lying perfectly still, eyes shut, machines beeping in a slow rhythm. And then one day they just wake up, sit up, ask what year it is, off, then on. A very long, very serious nap. But once you actually look at what neuroscientists have found out about consciousness during coma over the last 2 decades, that entire picture falls apart. And it falls apart in ways that are genuinely unsettling once you sit with them. Let's start with the thing that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Coma isn't one state. It's not a single light switch position. It's closer to a spectrum, and doctors have had to build an entire vocabulary just to describe the stops along it. There's coma itself, where the eyes stay closed and nothing can wake the person up. If a patient survives past that stage, some move into what's called a vegetative state, now more often called unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, where the eyes open and sleep-wake cycles return, but there's no outward sign the person is aware of anything happening around them. Beyond that sits something called a minimally conscious state, where flickers of awareness show up, inconsistently, like briefly following someone with their eyes, or squeezing a hand once out of 20 tries. And it's exactly that inconsistency that makes this whole field so difficult, because awake and aware turn out to be 2 completely different things that don't reliably come as a package deal. That distinction, arousal versus awareness, is the whole ballgame here, and it's also where the story gets genuinely strange, because for decades doctors had almost no way to test awareness directly. They relied on bedside behavior. Does the patient open their eyes, follow a simple command, track a moving object? It sounds reasonable, until you realize bedside behavior turns out to be a surprisingly unreliable way to find out what's actually happening inside someone's brain. And the discovery that blew that assumption apart traces back to a single patient in 2006. A neuroscientist named Adrian Owen put a 23-year-old woman, diagnosed as vegetative after a car accident, into an fMRI scanner. He asked her to imagine playing tennis. Then he asked her to imagine walking through the rooms of her house. 2 completely different mental tasks that reliably light up 2 completely different, well-documented parts of the brain. Her scan lit up exactly the way a healthy volunteer's would, every single time, on command. A woman who showed no outward sign of awareness whatsoever was, somewhere in there, following instructions perfectly. That one scan cracked the field wide open. Researchers now have a name for what's happening in patients like her: cognitive motor dissociation, sometimes called covert consciousness. And it turns out to be a lot more common than anyone originally guessed. A large international study published in 2024 tested 241 patients who showed 0 response to commands at the bedside, using a combination of fMRI and EEG. About 25% of them, 60 patients, showed clear, repeated brain activity that matched exactly what they'd been asked to do. Nobody in the room could tell just by looking at them. Their brains could. Here's the part that's genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. It's not that these patients are unaware. It's that the connection between I understand this and I want to respond, and my body actually does something, has been severed somewhere along the way. Researchers at Columbia University studying this exact phenomenon found that patients with cognitive motor dissociation can hear and comprehend what's being said to them. They simply can't get that understanding to translate into a physical response because the injury has damaged the specific wiring that relays instructions from the thinking brain to the moving body. It's less like the lights are off, and more like someone cut the wire that would let the person tell you the lights are still on. And this cuts both ways, which somehow makes it stranger. That same 2024 study also tested 112 patients who could follow commands at the bedside, unmistakably conscious by any normal definition. You'd expect every one of them to light up on the scans too. Instead, 62% of them didn't. meaning the scanning technology, as advanced as it's become, still misses a huge number of people who are unquestionably there. Nobody's found a perfect test yet in either direction. So if scans and bedside checks both miss people, what actually works? This is where the answer to the question in the title gets interesting, because one of the simplest, cheapest tools researchers have found is just saying someone's name. Multiple studies have tested this directly, playing a patient's own name alongside a completely meaningless sound, like a ringing bell, and watching what happens. In one study of 86 patients recovering from coma, 40% turned their head or eyes toward the sound of their own name, compared to only 23% who reacted to the bell at all. Other researchers went a level deeper and looked at where in the brain the response was actually happening. Patients whose brains processed their own name only in the primary auditory cortex, the most basic a sound-arrived region, tended to stay unresponsive. Patients whose brains lit up further, in the temporal lobe regions tied to actually recognizing and comprehending language, were far more likely to regain consciousness within a few months. Your own name, it turns out, might be one of the most reliable keys anyone has found for checking whether the lights are still on inside, which is also, weirdly, one of the more hopeful threads running through this whole topic, because it means the advice families are given, keep talking, keep playing familiar music, keep saying their name out loud, isn't just something handed out to make grieving relatives feel useful. There's a real, measurable signal researchers are chasing exactly there. Now let's bring in the condition that flips this entire topic upside down and shows just how wrong these assumptions can get in the opposite direction: locked-in syndrome. Unlike coma or a vegetative state, locked-in syndrome usually comes from damage to one very specific part of the brainstem, called the pons, and it leaves a person fully conscious, fully aware, thinking completely normally, while nearly every muscle in their body is paralyzed except the ones controlling their eyes. They can hear everything, they understand everything. They simply can't tell anyone because their body will not carry out a single instruction their brain sends it. Doctors, understandably, often assume these patients are comatose at first because there's nothing visible to suggest otherwise. Researchers studying locked-in patients have found that more than half the time, it's family members, not physicians, who first notice a deliberate eye movement and realize someone is actually in there, which raises the uncomfortable question sitting underneath this entire topic. How often does the system get it wrong the other way, sorting someone as unaware when they're actually not? Studies looking specifically at vegetative state diagnoses have found that somewhere between roughly 37 and 43% of patients labeled vegetative were later reclassified as minimally conscious once assessed with more careful, standardized testing. That number gets argued about a lot. Some researchers think it overstates how often the reclassification actually changes someone's day-to-day care in a meaningful way. But even the more conservative readings still put real, aware people on the wrong side of that line often enough that it's reshaping how hospitals are told to test patients before making any permanent decision about their care. There's also a genuinely important angle here about just how individual all of this is, because outcomes after a coma vary enormously depending on the injury itself. Doctors commonly use something called the Glasgow Coma Scale to score a patient's level of responsiveness on a simple numeric scale right after an injury, and the scores turn out to be remarkably predictive. Patients who score 11 or higher on that scale go on to wake up and recover in roughly 87% of cases. Patients who score 4 or lower stay in a coma or other disorder of consciousness in almost exactly that same percentage, 87%, just in the opposite direction. Two patients can look nearly identical lying in adjacent hospital beds and be on completely different trajectories, and a huge amount of that difference comes down to details invisible from the doorway. Which specific structures were damaged, how quickly oxygen was restored, how old the patient is, how their particular brain handles the injury, and the slow process of rebuilding coordinated activity afterward. This is also part of why modern hospitals have started layering multiple different testing tools on top of each other instead of trusting any single one. Quantitative EEG, a processed readout of the brain's electrical activity, has shown roughly 90% sensitivity and 80% specificity at telling a vegetative state apart from a minimally conscious one in research settings. fMRI, the tennis imagining test's home turf, actually performs worse on that same measure, somewhere around 44% sensitivity and 67% specificity, useful but nowhere near definitive on its own. None of these tools is good enough yet to be the last word. They're all just different, imperfect ways of asking the same impossible question: is anyone actually in there? Let's shift to the other end of this topic, because waking up from a coma turns out to be just as messy and unpredictable as the coma itself. Arguably messier. Coming back isn't one clean moment. For patients who spend time on a ventilator in intensive care, something called ICU delirium shows up constantly. Studies put it as high as 80% of mechanically ventilated patients, and it isn't subtle. Patients experience vivid, often terrifying hallucinations and delusions that feel completely real in the moment, sometimes convinced hospital staff are trying to hurt them, sometimes reliving entirely fabricated memories with total confidence. It isn't a personality glitch or a sign that anything new has gone wrong. It's a brain that's been through severe injury or illness trying to reboot every system at once, unevenly, with the parts responsible for judgment and clear memory generally among the last to come fully back online. Long after the body itself recovers, roughly a quarter of ICU survivors go on to develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress tied to what they experienced, or half-experienced, during that period, a rate researchers have compared directly to what's seen in combat veterans. There's a strange, almost uncomfortable symmetry to all of this, sitting right at both ends of the same event. Going in, doctors and families are left guessing whether anyone is home behind eyes that won't open. Coming out, they're left guessing how much of that time the person will actually remember, and how distorted whatever they do remember might be. The same uncertainty that makes the beginning of a coma so hard to read follows the patient all the way through to the other side. So where does that leave the actual question we started with? Can you hear anything while you're in a coma? Based on everything current research can tell us, the honest answer is probably. More of it lands than anyone used to assume, and for a meaningful minority of patients labeled completely unresponsive, a real, thinking mind is in there the whole time, picking up names, voices, maybe understanding far more than a still, silent body will ever let them show. Not for everyone. Not even for most people in the deepest stages of coma, but often enough that there's no point talking to them, they can't hear you, turns out to be one of the more quietly dangerous assumptions left in modern medicine, both for how families choose to spend those hours at the bedside, and for how doctors decide, sometimes permanently, whether someone gets more time to find their way back at all.